This lecture is entitled Foucault and Governmentality, and the purpose is to introduce Foucault's early thought, especially relating to this idea of governmentality. Around the idea of governmentality, we have other concepts such as power, knowledge, statistics, panopticon, biopower. The general idea around all these concepts is there is a new kind of control and discipline exerted over people in the modern period, and this is associated with a new kind of subjectivity. Remember, the word subjectivity means what it is to be you, how your experiences are uniquely yours, and there's a new kind of experience in the modern period of being an individual, which Foucault argues makes us more amenable to surveillance and control. So we can start off by considering a problem. In 1600, the King of France could say, "Off with his head," and it would happen. In the 21st century, the President of France can't do that anymore, or if he does it, he has to do it secretly. Now, if you believe Foucault, and most people in the social sciences agree with him on this point, that the state exerts much more power now over minds and bodies than in 1600. And it does this without exerting force. In fact, force is becoming largely unnecessary to control society like Australia or England or Japan. So how is this so? It's possible that Foucault's ideas of governmentality, which he developed in the 1970s, can help explain. Governmentality is a way of thinking about how to govern. Now, in 1600, the King of France, his main point was to stay in control of France. That was the main point. These days, the main point of governing is a population. Governing is focused towards a population. So, to give you another contrast, where I do field work, which is Southeast Asia, the ruler's main function used to be symbolized as a sense of being in harmony with the universe. So the old kings and sultans of Southeast Asia wanted to be in a state of harmony and balance. In modern Southeast Asia's governments existed primarily to do something rather than just being. The job now is to do something, to, quotes, provide themselves with a permanently crowded agenda of specific tasks to accomplish. Now, anybody who lives in a country with a modern political system will recognize this, the idea that government is about doing things for the population. So it's a way of thinking about population too. I'll give you an example. Before the Dutch colonizers arrived in Southeast Asia, there was a fairly fluid and, well, you could arguably there was a very fluid idea of peoples who belonged to what group. After the Dutch arrived, according to the argument, they started to categorize races. For example, in Indonesia, there was the Dutch people like themselves. There were foreign Orientals, which were like Chinese Indonesians, and then there were natives, or the Inlander, which was another race, and they gave different attributes to each race. The Dutch were white-skinned and advanced. The foreign Orientals were crafty and clever. The natives, or the inlanders, were lazy and governable. So there were people there to be governed by the Dutch. And this is the same in Australia now. We think of not just, for example, my government is always telling me to do things like save for my retirement, not to eat too much fat, to avoid smoking and reduce drinking, these kinds of things. So it's about governing individuals like myself, or in this case, the natives or the foreign Orientals of the Dutch colony in Indonesia. So the point of governing is to help things follow their natural course. This sounds really vague and silly, but it's probably the best way to sum it up. When my government tells me to wear a seatbelt, to wear a condom, to, or alternatively to populate Australia with more people. The point is that to let me live a long, happy life. That's the whole point of everything that my government has done and set out for me, which is that I should be educated, provided with education, health, etc., to live a long and healthy, happy life. So the idea is to safeguard and protect the population. Now, that's an example from Australia. If we look at Indonesia, the point was to get these native people who are lazy and ungovernable and turn them into governable subjects and to help advance them. So the idea was to help maju, which is take them forward, or membangun, which is to make them rise up or develop. So the goal of the colonizers with a modern's view of looking at governing was that they were in control of individual citizens who needed to be advanced and governed. Rather than, if you consider it, can contrast that with the pre-colonial model in Indonesia, where the point of ruling was just to remain in control and just to be in balance, or in 1600s France just to remain in control. So in both examples from Europe and Indonesia, and also in this perhaps from Australia too, we have a modern way of governing, which is about letting people follow their natural course in life, of a long, healthy, educated, whatever life. This contrasts with a pre-modern model where the object of governing was simply to remain in control. Now, in order to govern the population in this new way, in this modern way, you need a knowledge, and this comes from statistics. There's demographics, the government, the state, and I've been using the word government, but probably the more appropriate term, particularly for anthropology, is the state. So I'm going to use the state now in a rather crude sense, just meaning the bureaucracy, okay? So I'm going to swap from using the word government and now move to the word state in the sense of bureaucracy. The state looks at where I live, for example, Bandura in Victoria of Australia, sees that there's a rising population here of young people, wants to increase the number of schools and skate parks. He wants to produce a new clinic, develop some social housing. It will measure the results of kids in tests at the local schools and see how they're doing. We'll measure health results. Everything, all the statistics are all based around gathering an incredible amount of knowledge about what's going on where I live, which is Bandura, Australia. And this is the case with states, modern states throughout the world. They have an incredible amount of knowledge. That's something that the King of France in 1600 or a Southeast Asian king or sultan in 1600 could never have even dreamt of. Wouldn't require in the first place, and even if they felt they required it, couldn't actually achieve that level of knowledge. So when the Dutch, for example, came to Indonesia, they decided, we need to know all about the local population, so we'll study their local customs and traditions, which was called adat. And using this, they sent out scholars, such as myself, 200 years ago, or maybe more like 100 years ago too, 200 to 100 years ago, in the 1800s to early 1900s, to categorize people. You say, well, there are Balinese people, and the Balinese people of Bali recognize certain rights, and they have certain laws. And they said, all right, well, Bali's one area, and then we'll look at East Java and Lombok as separate areas. So they just drew these arbitrary lines and called these groups or peoples, and formed ethnic identities around them, around certain areas, which they then required to control the population, and also in fact reinforced those identities. So the argument is, prior to this, that somebody in Far East Java might not have been all that different to somebody in Bali, but who was on another island. But once the Dutch formed these very critical and arbitrary lines between different areas and attributed different ethnic groups to these areas. They actually reinforced and actually formed a new kind of identity, a Balinese identity or a Far East Javanese identity. So you get a similar kind of thing happening in Australia, where the state needs to understand problems, feels it needs to understand, for example, the problems with Aboriginal Australians. So it categorises Aboriginal Australians as being this or being that, then defines them as belong to certain groups, like you'll belong to this native title group, you'll belong to that native title group, all of which might not have actually represented something that occurred naturally prior to European arrival in Australia, but yet once the state has created these ethnic groups which correspond to these native title organisations, then Aboriginal identities themselves begin to change into being the kind of identity that is readily understandable by the state, or readily legible is a term that's often used, legible, which means you make yourself able to be read by the state. That's a pretty complicated example. I'll give you maybe a for instance. For instance, I'm an Aboriginal person in Perth, Western Australia. In order to achieve my political goals, I want to put in a native title claim. I have to make myself understood by the Australian state, and I do that by representing myself in a certain way as belonging to a certain group, a Nyungar group, for example, and having certain traditional beliefs that I know that the state will recognise. So what's happening is that to make myself legible to the state, I have to craft my identity in such a way that it adheres to state policy. Alright, that's quite a bit of a digression. I want to get back to the main point, which is that these new states, the modern states, whether in Australia, in France or Indonesia, have unprecedented levels of knowledge about the population. But it's not just a question of knowing the population, but making the population docile is the term that Foucault uses. Making them able to be supervised, to be surveilled, in the sense of surveillance. So this knowledge and discipline construes the population in such a way that it's more easily controlled. So if you go back to this example, control over Indigenous people, I'm a Nyungar person in Southwest Australia. In a way, to create my identity in such a way that it is recognised by the state, I have to change myself into a more easily controlled subject. A more easily controlled subject, a legible, docile body, as Foucault called it. Now Foucault thinks these docile bodies were very useful, particularly in modern Europe, because they were productive bodies. They were bodies that could be turned to the factories of Europe, or in Southeast Asia, to the mines and the plantations that would feed Europe's industrialization. These were docile bodies, easily governable bodies. Now, to make these bodies easily governable, the household, the family household became the center of control. So the household became kind of a fixture of statistics and particularly demography. Now in Australia we've just had our census. The way it's organised is in relation to the household. Who was in this house on this night of this date in 2016 in Australia? The same thing in Indonesia. The household is actually incorporated, and in Japan is incorporated into the structure of the state. You go down from like a national to provincial to district to sub-district to city to let's say suburb, and then within the suburb sub-suburb, and then underneath that level you'll have household heads. So the household head, which is typically the father, is incorporated into the state control, into the state apparatus, into the state bureaucracy. So as I mentioned, this is creating docile productive bodies that in Southeast Asia at least were part of the monocrop fields, the bananas, the coconuts, the rubber, the processing sheds for the tea and the coffee, and the plantation barracks, which made the natives of Indonesia more disciplined and more productive, or made the European worker in the 1800s in his factory or her factory more disciplined and more productive. So it's tied up with the growth of capitalism too. One example from Java, when this plantation system was organised, you can see this is what it was prior. Say in the pre-modern form, a village in Indonesia might look like this. This is where the village chief lived, and there were some people living in houses here, houses there, houses there. It was all a bit higgledy-piggledy and random. After 1835, with the plantation system, all the houses were arranged in a row. This enabled a kind of surveillance. The village guard or the village head or the Dutch official who was visiting could walk up and down, and immediately all these houses would be amenable to his gaze. Gaze is another big word for Foucault. Or legible. They would become legible, easily read by the state. So continuing on with Indonesia, for example, the Dutch school and welfare programs thrust the government into much more direct involvement with the affairs of its subject. So what we're getting is not just in the Dutch colony of Indonesia, but in the Australian national state right now as I'm talking, or in Europe, is that a concern for the welfare of the subjects, a concern for the welfare of the population leads to greater control. And what I've been trying to get at here is that governmentality might explain this. A concern for the welfare of the population leads to a knowledge of the welfare of the population, which is sometimes called savoir, the French knowing, or the English word savvy, which somebody who knows a lot of stuff, the savvy of the bureaucracy, the savoir, which allows for control and discipline of the population. Now, the famous example you probably heard before is the panopticon. Panopticon is a jail that was designed by Jeremy Bentham. There weren't actually many panopticon jails built on the Bentham design. There is one where I'm from in Fremantle in Western Australia, a tiny little jail there. You can look it up on Wikipedia or Google. What was the name of it? Fremantle something jail. Not the Fremantle jail, it had another name. Anyway, the point is there's a central guard tower in the middle, and around that is a big circle where all the inmates are confined in their cells. So if you are the guard and you're sitting in this tower, you can look around and see every single cell and every single inmate. By contrast, if you are the inmate, you have no contact with the people next to you. You can't even see them, and you can barely make out people on the opposite side of the prison. What becomes of you is that you become individualized. You see yourself as a single person. Now, this is such a common idea in the West that most people take it for granted. They think that in order to understand society, we start with individuals. Most work in anthropology, particularly from what was called the I think it was the New Melanesian School, people like Marilyn Strathern and their idea of individual went the other way around and said, we need to think about people firstly as part of a social group, a society or a clan, and then secondly, if at all, as individuals. In fact, the idea of individual might be relevant only to modern societies. Now, Foucault's idea is that the panopticon was an actual jail designed by a famous British political theorist named Bentham, but that also provides a model for how you and I live in the world. we live as if we're in a panopticon. In fact, we are so used to living as individuals in this way that to a greater extent than ever before, we don't need jails for control. In other words, unless you've been to jail, most of us just go about our daily lives strictly adhering to the rules as if we were being surveilled or being watched from a central watchtower. That watchtower doesn't need to exist because it now exists in our minds. We have put that watchtower in our own minds, and we regard our own behaviour as if we were our own prison guards. So let's try and explain that another way. Express it again. So this is the design of the panopticon. This is the prison, and this is a cross section cut through the middle. You can see these are the individual cells, and in the middle is a tower. Or looking from above, bird's eye view, here are the individual cells, and here's the tower. You and I live like this, separate from each other as individuals in the modern state. In the panopticon, this is an actual panopticon that was built by the look of it, the prisoner is subjected to constant surveillance. They might always be, whatever they do might be under the scrutiny of the prison warden. Similarly, when we go about our day, we act as if we were under surveillance. You're driving at 2 o'clock at night, and you get a red light, and it seems like the light's broken. You're a good citizen, you'll just wait and wait and wait for it to go green. Or it's 2 a.m. in the morning, there's a red light sign for pedestrians, you can't cross the road, and a lot of people will hesitate before crossing, even though they can't see cars either way. Now, part of that, of course, might be a sense of trepidation and whatever, anxiety, but partly the idea is that this is a result of a sort of internal surveillance machine we've all built into our brains as the part of becoming individuals in Western society. Now, in this model of the panopticon, the supervisor is actually invisible. This is where it gets very interesting. Foucault says you don't actually even need to have a supervisor in there. All you need is for the people in these cells to think they might be being watched, for them to behave as docile bodies, as legible, docile bodies. And again, most of us do not even need these jails to act in this way. We have built ourselves into those cells of a prison, a sort of imagined prison that we live in as we go through our daily lives. So these ideas I've just suggested were very popular in the 80s and 90s in understandings of particularly of the state, and they still continue now into the naughties. There was quite a lot of research, particularly on Indonesia and state and development programs, strongly influenced by Foucault. And the vision was a disciplinary society, a society that was disciplined, which had been created through passive surveillance, which is us guarding ourselves, surveilling ourselves. And these are the notions, again, of panopticism, a way of looking at the world as if you were subjected to constant surveillance and living as an individual. Statistics gathered by the state, which provided new levels of knowledge for its statecraft. Power knowledge, the way, for example, certain groups of people, such as Indigenous Australians or Balinese, are created and reinforced by the state. Governmentality, which I've just told you about, and finally biopower, which is an idea that, to give you an example, from about 10 years ago in Australia, the Australian government sent people tape measures to measure their waists. The idea was that people would measure their waists and be alarmed at how fat their tummies were, and attempt to reduce that fat, the government had the very laudable and noble aim of reducing, I don't know, cancer and diabetes amongst Australians. But scholars of Foucault would say, yes, that is very noble and laudable, but there is a flip side to these programs. The flip side is that people then begin to measure themselves and surveil themselves, and might also get to the extent where they voluntarily submit that data, for example, through censuses or through visits to the doctor, when information is fed back to a central bureaucracy of the state. So in other words, knowing about the biometrics of the body enables the state new levels of knowledge and thus control. And that's the biopower idea. You can see that they're not all that distinct. Biopower has a large crossover with statistics, and they all have a large crossover with power knowledge and governmentality and so on. So the power knowledge bit would be, okay, if they want to work out whether you're Balinese or Aboriginal Australian, they might have in the past looked to your what were you, quarter, half blood or full blood, silly things like that, or they might do DNA tests now to develop a sense of certain classes of people, male or female or whatever. So you can see these are all kind of related and but just slightly different in their emphasis. So biopower is the idea that basic biological features of the human species became the object of a political strategy. So when we're measuring our wastes, ostensibly what we're doing is just making sure we don't get cancer and diabetes, etc. But what we're doing is voluntarily submitting ourselves into this form of docile, individualized bodies, which include us into the mechanisms of state power. It makes us more governable by the state, that kind of thinking and attitude. And especially then if the data is fed back to the state, it enables that power knowledge, or savoir, which is another word I expressed, savoir, which I expressed before. So a new kind of political subject is created through being categorized. You're Balinese, you're Indigenous, non-Indigenous, mapped. You belong in Southwest Australia and recorded. Your waist is this dimensions, your height is this dimensions, etc. And this is the principal object of state power, this new kind of political subject. So in other words, your subjectivity and my subjectivity are fundamentally different to the subjectivity of our ancestors in 1600s. We have become political subjects. They were a very different kind of subject, our 1600s ancestors. So this idea was just hugely influential in the social sciences. In the 70s it starts to take off, 80s and 90s, and right through the noughties, and only now it seems to be on the wane somewhat in the social sciences. I'm just going to pull out two examples, which is almost crazy to pull out two when there's about another 1,000 examples that I'm sure around. Duss and Poole, anthropologists, talk about the way the state claims to secure identities through identity cards, passports, birth and death, and marriage certificates. So when you get an identity card or a passport or a license, as the case may be, your identity becomes secured in a certain way. You get labelled into a place, like born in this location. You get attributed a mother and father. You might get attributed things that are useful to you, like you're Indigenous, you can apply for these schemes, or you're lower socioeconomic, you apply for these schemes. But you also have an identity that is made legible and secured through the state. Another example that comes to mind is being unemployed when I finished my first degree at university, and we had a rather generous welfare system in Australia back then, but at the same time to obtain money, the dole as it was called, the welfare payouts, I had to also submit myself to becoming a kind of governable body, a governable body, a docile body, a body that was with a sort of a political subjectivity, an individual subjectivity. I had to fill out all the data about myself, my background, etc., how much money I made, and had to, every fortnight, had to call up, what was it called back then? I think they called it Centrelink, or maybe something else back then. and he had to submit this information in order to be able to receive these payments. But at the same time, I was turning myself into a body that was heavily governable by the Centrelink, which meant that if they felt there was a job that I should go for, they would call me and demand that I went for this job, etc., etc. So I became legible to the government, a more docile and easily managed or controlled body in the process. We're going to look at in another lecture about Agamben, who talks about disciplinary control achieved by a new biopower. So he talks about the mechanisms and calculations of state power and the way that the state can, for example, create bare life. And bare life means a killable body. For example, a prisoner to be executed, or a person on life support who's been in a terrible car accident, who might be allowed to be executed. What counts as a fetus that can be killed, if you like, legally. So things that can be legally killed, that is the power of the state. The state has this new power to create certain bodies as killable. It's a state of exception. It can create exceptions, the legally killable body. So the ideas from Foucault are built up by Agamben in a different direction, which we'll look at, as I said, in another lecture. So Foucault argues that in the modern era, the state exerts more power over minds and bodies, such that force is now unnecessary. In fact, if a government needs to get the police out, there's a riot or something like this, what it shows is that governmentality is breaking down. So states that regularly reach for the batons or the tear gas or the gun are thought of from within this paradigm as being weak states, because the people are not yet docile governable bodies, like for example in Australia, where the state rarely has to reach for the baton in order to make me go about my business in a docile and productive way. So what we're talking about here is a society where force becomes increasingly unnecessary. It's a new kind of society, a disciplinary society, where people become individual subjects. Their minds are subjected to reform. It used to be you might be tortured in 1600 or torn apart, as a famous example from Foucault's Discipline and Punish relates, but torn apart by horses. So it used to be that the object of control was the body. Now the object of control is the mind. It's the mind that has to be reformed in order to make the body docile. And what has happened is this process has been largely successful. The control is now internalized, such that we now watch ourselves, we now surveil ourselves. And that's the basic ideas around Foucault's idea of governmentality. Thank you.